Good morning. My name is John Walsh, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to WOLA this morning, a cold morning for our event on human rights and drug policy. We're starting a little late. I think today's the kind of day when people want to snuggle back under their sheets and stay in bed. But of course, we had something even better to offer you. A discussion about a big topic, an important topic, drug policy and human rights, and a hard topic. So we don't pretend we're going to exhaust that topic this morning, but we do have two speakers who are going to get us off to a flying start. And we're thrilled and honored to have both Rodrigo Primni, Director of De Justicia, the Colombian think tank based in Bogota, and Jose Miguel Vivanco, Executive Director of America's Division, Human Rights Watch. It shows my age, right? Based here in Washington, our neighbor. So I have executive directors and lawyers on either side of me. They have illustrious resumes. I'm not even going to try to do them justice right now, especially since we're a few minutes behind. Just to say, Rodrigo is a founder and director of De Justicia, a professor of constitutional law, human rights, and theory of the state at the Universidad Nacional in Bogota. He also currently serves on Colombia's Drug Policy Advisory Commission. From 1994 to 2004, he served as deputy judge of Colombia's Constitutional Court. And as you'll hear, his research focuses on the intersection between drug policy, human rights, constitutional law, and the tension between law and economics. Again, these are just highlights. You can go to their websites and find a lot more. Jose Miguel is Director of Human Rights Watch, America's Division. He hails from Chile and is a general expert on Latin America. Before joining Human Rights Watch, he was an attorney for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the OAS. He founded in 1990 the Center for Justice and International Law, CEJIL, an NGO that files complaints before international human rights bodies. And he has been an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Rodrigo is going to speak first for about half an hour, followed by Jose Miguel, about 10 to 12 minutes. Both of them will speak in English. And before Rodrigo gets started, I just want to welcome our audience who's joining us via live stream, wherever they may be, and let everyone know that the entire event, the video will be posted to our website, www.wola.org afterwards. Also, be sure you don't miss the new essay on human rights and drug policy by Jose Miguel's colleague, Maria McFarland. We have some out on the table. And with that, Rodrigo, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. I would like first to thank WOLA for this invitation to share with you some comments about the relationship, or sometimes the lack of relationship, between drug policy and human rights. The thesis that I want to develop is that we have to have a human rights approach in drug policy. And we have to have this kind of approach not only for ethical or political considerations, these are of course very important, but also because of legal obligation. My argument is that there are legal grounds that oblige the states to adopt a human rights framework in drug policy. That's my main argument. And I will develop this argument in 4 points. I will begin by presenting the problem. And the problem is that we have 2 international legal regimes, the international drug law regime and the human rights international regime that seems to be independent. There seem to be this kind of self-contained legal regimes that spoke Professor Koskeniemi in his report about fragmentation of international law to the United Nations. But I will show that they are not separated, that there are tensions between them. And if there are tensions between them, and that's the second point, we have to develop a way to solve these tensions. And the second point is to develop what we can call the solution of the problem, the general solution of the problem. And the general solution of the problem is to try to harmonize the obligation of the states in relation to drug law and human rights, but that in case of contradiction, we have to give preeminence to human rights obligation, and I will say why. So, and that's the main thesis. You have to develop, you are obliged, states are obliged to develop a human rights approach to drug policy. In the third point, I will try to show what are the implications of this approach. What does it mean to have a human rights approach to drug policy? Is it just rhetoric, or has it real implications? And therefore, after explaining the approach, I will try to show concrete consequences of this approach in practical policy decisions, to show that we are not in an abstract academic discussion. Of course, academic abstract discussions are valuable in themselves, but that in this case we are in an academic discussion that have very important practical consequences in policy choices. These are my 4 points. Let's begin with the first point, the problem. If you look at international drug law and international human rights law, you see some kind of the state and some specific monitoring bodies. For instance, in human rights law, human rights that has the duty to monitor and to evaluate the compliance of the states with this obligation. So you have some kind of self-contained legal regime. And if you look to drug law, it seems the same. You have some principles and you have some main foundational conventions. For instance, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, or the Vienna Convention on Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances of 1988. And you have also specific monitoring bodies. Specific, you have the INCB, the International Narcotics Control, duty to monitor the compliance. That wouldn't be a problem in regulation that didn't interfere relations between this regulation and human rights. The more you fulfill the obligation and you look at a policy decision based on human rights, you see that there are contradictions between them. I was told in a discussion with a member of the staff of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission that sometimes some states in Latin America say that to the states. When we have to speak with the CICAD, that is the monitoring body concerning drug law, some years ago, the CICAD has changed a little, and it's very important, but some years ago, they said you have to have tougher laws on drug. You have to increase penalties, you have to put a lot of people in jail. But when the Inter-American Human Rights Commission arrived to the same country, they say, okay, you have too many people in jail, you have a criminalization that is excessive and disproportionate, etc. And you can find a lot of tension on contradiction between some decisions based upon international drug law that infringe human rights, or on the contrary, decisions that are based upon human rights that, in a sense, can contradict obligations in relation to international drug law. Let me try to systematize a little. No, I don't say that I'm going to be thoroughly systematic, but systematize a little these tensions. In some cases, you have policy decisions that are grounded, for instance, in international drug law, but that are not compulsory. That are decisions that the states take grounded on international drug law, but that could be otherwise. They are not obliged to do these decisions, and these decisions infringe human rights law. For instance, we have shown in a research made by several research organizations in Latin America that we make part of a network called SED. We have made a research about the increasing penalties in Latin America in relation of drug crimes. not violent drug crimes. We are speaking of when consumption is criminalized, consumption of minor trafficking or trafficking without violence. And we have shown that in Latin America, in many countries, because of the severity of the penalties in relation of drug crimes, it becomes, at least legally, more serious, more egregious to traffic with some grams of cocaine, of heroin, than to kill another person or to rape a woman. And of course, that is, at least according to my view, a violation of human rights law, because these are laws that are not proportional. And second, you can see in all Latin America, but even in the United States, that many people are incarcerated for non-violent drug crimes. We are not speaking of the drug lords that put bombs and kill people. We are speaking of small traffickers, consumers, and there have been an increase in incarceration in Latin America and in the United States, mainly because of harsher penalties in drug laws. And that also implies, in practical terms, violation of human rights, because prisons in Latin America and the United States are overcrowded, and the prison conditions do not satisfy minimum requirements of human dignity. But these are not compulsory obligations. States could fulfill their obligation in other way, but in fact there are tensions between the way the state try to comply with their obligation in drug law and their implication in human rights. The second is when there are tension or contradictions the other way. That is, states that wants to take some measures because they say that these measures, even if they are not compulsory, but these measures are grounded on human rights law. But when they take it, they are criticized because they say this policy cannot be adopted because it contradicts obligation under international drug law. If you want, the more recent experience is the discussion about the Uruguayan experience to legalize some form of legal distribution of cannabis. They say this contradicts your obligation under the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, and that might be in an isolated interpretation right, because the 1961 Single Convention doesn't allow legal distribution of marijuana for recreative drug use, but only for medical and research purposes. But the Uruguayan government say, okay, but I'm developing a policy because I think it's the best way to protect human rights of consumers. We don't want consumers to be subjected to criminal gangs and criminal distribution. We think that that is kind of violation of human rights law, human rights of drug users. So I am allowed to develop this policy because it's grounded on a human rights, and health is a human right and a health approach. And you have also this kind of contradiction or tensions. And second, we have tension when you have clearly obligation under human rights, under drug law that contradicts, according to certain interpretation that I share, some specific human rights, For instance, I can only mention two because of limits of time. The first one is the mere fact, when some people think that according to international drug law, you have to criminalize drug consumption. It's not true, because in this kind, the International Convention gives latitude to the states, but they think that they are obliged, and other people think this is against the right to privacy, because the right to privacy is the right to take decisions concerning your own personality, your own plan of life, if you don't affect rights of third parties. And then you have this kind of tension. Or according to the 1961 convention, then the 1988 convention, Vienna Convention gave a more flexible regulation, but at the beginning, according to the 1961 convention, states have to eradicate coca crops. But of course, in some countries, indigenous cultures use coca as a ritual tradition. And then you have a tension between human rights of indigenous population and obligations under the international drug law. So I think that here we have a problem. And if we have a problem, the best way is not to ignore it, but to try to solve it. Until now, I think the states usually have ignored it. They said, we have human rights obligation, we have international drug law obligation, but we don't have to try to see how we comply with both obligations. And if we accept, not that in all fields, but that in some fields, there are contradictions between the way you fulfill human rights obligation and the way you fulfill obligation under international drug law, then you have to try first way to harmonize this kind of obligations. That's the easiest way. And it's a very important one. Even if there is discussion if international law is a system, there is this well-known report that I spoke before about the fragmentation of the international legal system. Even if we understand that it's not a coherent system, I think that states should assume that the international legal system is should be coherent, and then that the states should develop a perspective to try to fulfill all their obligations under international law. So the first easiest way is to try to harmonize obligation. That is, to comply obligation in relation to international drug law that reinforce obligations in human rights and vice versa. But the problem is that I think that there are fields in which harmonization is not possible, that there are contradictions, because if you want to develop sounded policies grounded on human rights, then it enters in contradiction with strict interpretation of international drug law. And when there are these kind of contradictions, what should be the solution? And the solution can be only one way or the other. Either you give preeminence to international drug law, either you give preeminence to human rights. The third solution is to try to harmonize. But when you cannot, what is the alternative? And I would argue that the alternative, not only for ethical or political consideration, is to give preeminence to human rights law, to international human rights law. The thesis is, if there is a contradiction between obligation in relation to international drug law and human rights, and international human rights, state should give preeminence to human rights, not only for ethical or political consideration, but for legal consideration. And what are those legal considerations? And I think there are at least two. You can develop more, but at least two. The first is the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations, in its Article 103, said that obligation under the Charter of the United Nations prevail to other obligations of the state. And I think that obligations in human rights are grounded in the Charter of the United Nations. The Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is judged to be a development of the obligation under the Charter of the United Nations. So human rights are enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. So we can say that these are a kind of obligation that derive from the Charter of the United Nations. Whereas drug obligations, even if they are sponsored by United Nations bodies, there are not obligations under the Charter of the United Nations. If you read the Charter of the United Nations, you don't find anything about drugs. You find a lot about obligations to protect and develop human dignity and to protect and develop human rights. So if there is a contradiction between treaties concerning human rights and treaties concerning drug laws, I would argue that if you take into account seriously Article 103 of the Charter of the United Nations, you should give preeminence to human rights. And the second is the jus cogens norms. That is, norms that are compulsory under the international community, and if there is a contradiction with a jus cogens norm and an obligation derived from a treaty, then you should give, this implies that the treaty is void, and you should give preeminence to the jus cogens norms. And I think that there is discussion if all human rights are jus cogens. I won't argue that. I won't argue that all human rights are jus cogens. But I would argue that the principle of respect of human rights is jus cogens. That is, not all the contents of all the treaties of human rights are jus cogens. But I think that is an accepted norm that cannot be contradicted in the international community, that states must respect human rights. So if there is a contradiction between drug law and the principle of respect of human rights, then the principle of respect of human rights prevails over obligation under drug law. So I think I would argue that I rest my case in saying that obligation on human rights prevail over obligation under drug law when there is contradiction. And that's what I call the legal necessity to build a human rights approach to drug law. Not only for policy consideration or ethical consideration, for legal consideration. It's an obligation for the states to develop a human rights approach to drug policy. And this leads me to the third point. And what does it mean to have a human rights approach? And I would argue that to have a human rights approach implies at least 5 points. It has been developed a lot in general about what does it mean to have a human rights approach to different policies. I will try to apply it to drug policy. First, I think it means to take into account seriously, when you speak about drug law, of the obligation of the states in relation to human rights. When you speak of drug law, of drug policy, you have to remember all the time all the kind of obligation of the state in relation to human rights. Not only the obligation to respect, to not infringe human rights, but also the other obligation, that is the obligation to guarantee human rights, or as the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee of the United Nations says, the obligation to protect, the obligation to respect, the obligation to protect, that is to avoid that one person infringe the human rights of another person, and the obligation to fulfill. First point. The second point is that in case of contradiction of this obligation of the state with the obligation under international drug law, this obligation prevails. And this is very important. That means that not only obligation not to infringe, but also to guarantee. That's my main point to say why I think Uruguay has a good legal point to say that it can develop a kind of legal distribution of marijuana, because it's grounded on a duty to protect and a duty to fulfill the right to health and to protect consumers from criminality. It's not, that would be the second point. The third point that is specific to drug policy is to consider users as right holders. No, sometimes they say that this has been, at least in the Americas, a very big and very positive evolution, because users are not anymore considered criminals, but now they are considered sick people. I'm not so sure that it's a great evolution, because at least when you are a criminal, you have some kind of autonomy. I say, I want to make that crime. Now they say, no, you are just a sick person. And I would say, some users, of course, are sick person because they have become dependent of some substance. But not all users are sick person. And then to develop a general framework for consumption based on the idea that either the user is a criminal or a sick person is not to have a human rights approach for drug policy. Four, you have to apply in drug policy what people, what academicians and United Nations bodies call the cross-cutting principle of human rights in policy. That is, human rights monitoring bodies have developed at least 3 principles that should be applied in all policies if you want to adopt really a human rights approach. These 3 principles are the principle of non-discrimination. That is, you have to develop the policy in order to avoid discrimination and to protect especially people that have been discriminated. Second, the principle of participation. You have to develop the policies in a form to allow people who will be subject to this policy to participate in their formulation. And first, the principle of accountability. You have to develop mechanisms to make possible that authorities are held accountable for this policy. So I think if you want to develop a human rights approach to drug law, you have to incorporate in drug law this principle. And finally, you have to develop some kind of human rights indicators to evaluate this policy. It's not finally, I have 2 points. If you take seriously this cross-cutting principle, first you have to develop indicators in order to allow the evaluation of the policy not only in drug policy terms, but also in human rights terms. So it's not enough to say, okay, we have a reduction of the supply of this kind of drugs, but you have to say what have been the impact of this policy in human rights terms. And finally, you have to develop a differential approach in this kind of policy, because if you take seriously the principle of non-discrimination, you have to evaluate the specific impact of this policy upon populations that have been discriminated and are in a situation of vulnerability, like poor people, like indigenous communities, etc. So you have to develop all those kind of approaches. And finally, and with that I finish, I think that if you develop this kind of approach, this has practical implication. I'm not going to develop all these practical implications because I think it's for discussion also, and because we have time constraints. But I think that at least you can say that you have at least these 3 or 4 practical implications if you take seriously a human rights approach to drug law. First, you should decriminalize drug consumption if you take seriously the idea of consumers' rights as right holders. Second, you have to reformulate all the criminal policy in drug law, because it, in almost all countries, is a disproportionate system. Penalties are too harsher for the real gravity of the crimes that have been punished. Third, you have to develop in the supply side different policies concerning aerial sprayal or fumigation that have been developed in countries like mine, in Colombia, that in practical terms has a deep cost in health, in the right to health, and in the right to environment. 4, you have to reformulate the procedures in drug law that usually are procedures that are do not respect the due process of law. The two main exceptions in almost all democratic states concerning restrictions that violate the due process of law are in anti-terrorism policy and in anti-drug policies. So you have to reformulate this kind of procedures. And finally, I think that you have to allow some innovative experience that try to develop, like the experience in Uruguay, that might be in its face contradicting the single convention, but that are a kind of development of the duty to fulfill the right to health and other human rights. And I think in this way we can achieve a more human drug policy and not the policy that currently has been developed in almost all of our countries. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a tour de force, and we'll have a lot to talk about. And first we're going to hear from Jose Miguel.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It is a real privilege for me to be part of this panel, together with Professor Uprimi, who has obviously delivered a very compelling and I would say brilliant explanation of the human rights approach to new, hopefully new policies on drug use in this region, but also in this country. And it's also a pleasure to be here together with John Walsh, Tuwola. Walsh, as well as Adam Isaacson, have been pioneers on this subject. We have joined the club only recently, and I will make some brief remarks so we will have a chance to debate and to exchange some views on this very, very complex issue. At Human Rights Watch, we have experience documenting human rights abuses associated with the war on drugs for many years in the region. We have seen the huge impact the drug war has taken in places like Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico. From the carnage of brutal drug trafficking organizations to the abuses by security forces fighting them. We have documented how the criminalization of drug use has undermined the right to health of drug addicts, preventing them from getting necessary treatment, and the right to privacy of casual drug users. Last year, we conducted an extensive review of the relevant policy, law, and history, and we reached several conclusions. One, the personal use of drugs should be decriminalized. To deter harmful drug use, governments should rely instead on non-penal regulatory and public health policies. Two, governments should be willing and able to consider alternatives for the legal regulation of drug production and distribution that could reduce the levels of violence and corruption associated with the war on drugs approach. Subjecting people to criminal sanctions for the personal use of drugs infringes on their autonomy and the right to privacy. Limitations on autonomy and privacy cannot be justified unless they meet certain criteria such as purpose, proportionality, and necessity. Protecting health is a legitimate purpose. But criminalizing drug use to protect people from harming themselves does not meet the criteria of necessity or proportionality. There are many steps that governments can and should take to deter, prevent, and remedy the harmful use of drugs. But they shouldn't do it by punishing the people whose health they are trying to protect. Non-penal options to reduce harm to people who use drugs include offering substance abuse treatment and social support, substitution therapies, needle exchange, education, administrative penalties, fines, community service, mandatory classes, suspension of license, travel bans. Human Rights Watch research has showed that the criminalization of drug use has undermined the right to health. Fear of criminal penalties deters people who use drugs from using health services and treatment, and increases their risk of violence, discrimination, and serious illness. Criminal prohibitions have also impeded the use of drugs for legitimate medical research and have prevented patients from accessing drugs for palliative care and pain treatment. When someone under the influence of drugs does something that could harm others, criminal sanctions might be entirely appropriate, just as they are when people use alcohol in a way that endangers others. However, the penalty is not for the drug use alone, but for engaging in activity that could endanger others while under the influence of drugs. The enforcement of criminal laws on drug production and distribution in the Americas and elsewhere in the world has resulted directly or indirectly in serious and sometimes widespread and systematic human rights violations. Criminalization has increased the profitability of illicit drug markets. That has in turn fueled the growth and operations of groups, including paramilitaries and guerrillas in Colombia and organized crime in Mexico, that commits atrocities, undermine public security, and weaken the rule of law. In the United States, Human Rights Watch has documented unjustifiable racial disparities in drug and law enforcement and grossly disproportionate sentences. With regard to the international drug conventions, we would like to make some comments on that. International drug conventions should be interpreted and, where necessary, revised to ensure that they do not prohibit or discourage governments from adopting policies that would enable them to reduce the human rights cost of current policies. More than 95% of United Nations member countries are parties to the 3 core drug treaties, which obliged governments to make the possession, purchase, or cultivation of drugs for personal consumption a criminal offense. Although the treaties offer some, as Professor Uprimi just said,
but the question is, how can we be more effective on bringing these arguments that, of course, are the ones that need to be used into convincing or creating some space with these hardcore countries?
By trying to get the elephant of South America pretty much supporting this clearly supporting this new tendency. And as long as Brazil is not is pretty absent from this, or very much absent from this debate, I'm quite skeptical that we will have some traction in South America. Also, I believe that the ALBA countries could do something constructive here, but it could be difficult for them since Cuba has such a autocratic and reactionary and repressive view of drug policies. I invite you to check on the speech of Raúl Castro when he was in Santiago, Chile, just a year ago, nominated president of CELAC. He said, "A sangre y fuego," you know. We need to just keep enforcing the most repressive, you know, he even invoked the death penalty as a valid option, you know.
And he was
said,
smoking a tobacco?
I don't know. I don't know. So, for, you know, as long as, you know, the ALBA countries that are very noisy, usually on some issues that are against the promotion and protection of human rights, could be pretty helpful if President, for instance, Correa of Ecuador and Maduro from Venezuela revise openly and publicly their position on this issue. But without that type of clear support, you know, I'm quite skeptical about how far the Latin countries are willing to go on this issue. In spite of the leadership of Guatemala, Colombia in particular, even, I would say, more than Mexico.
I would add a point, not in political analysis, but in the kind of arguments. I support a change of the international legal regime on two ethical and political considerations that usually are not always go to the same direction, but in that case go exactly to the same direction. What I mean is, you can be against the current international drug regime because of autonomy and privacy issues, like developed by Jose Miguel, that I agree with. That is, if you accept that people have a right to their own body, then they have the right to do with their own body what they want, as long as they don't infringe upon the right of third parties. And that means that you have some kind of right to access to psychoactive substances. And I think that's a good argument, and I buy it, and I agree with it, and I defend it. But I know that this argument is not very convincing for many people. It's convincing for very liberal people, but for many people it's not convincing. So you have to use at the same time, or mainly, the other argument that in this case goes in the same direction, and is a utilitarian and cost-benefit analysis. That is, if you take into account the cost, the enormous cost of the current policies, and the possible benefits of the current policies, even if it's very difficult to make cost-benefit analysis because you are trying to compare things that are difficult to compare, I think that there is an overwhelming evidence of the failure of the enormous cost of these policies. And this argument might be much more persuasive for other people that says, I don't buy the argument that people have a right to privacy to consume drugs, but I accept that criminalizations creates more harm than good, and then that we can change the policies. And these kind of arguments can be accepted even by people that do not are very supportive of human rights, because it's a more general utilitarian argument. If you saw that these current policies develop criminal gangs, makes much more difficult to attend adequate persons and all those kind of arguments, then you can develop another kind of argument that are persuasive for another kind of people. And I think that in this case, both arguments go in the same direction. In other policy arenas, it's not the case, but I think here it's the case.
If I could just add an observation in response to this question as well. I think one thing, and Rodrigo and Francisco mentioned it, the treaties themselves already have latitude on the question of criminalization. There is no obligation to criminalize and consumption, and possession for personal consumption. And that is a huge issue nonetheless, not just in the United States, but in the region. There's an enormous amount of progress that could be made by stopping the criminalization of possession for personal consumption in all countries without running afoul of the conventions at all. So that is a reform that can happen at the national level and be brought to the international debate where it already exists, I think in a strong way by the region, if governments and societies want to make a big step there, a big quadruple step. The other point is flexibility is good. The need for flexibility comes when governments, take steps like Uruguay has done, despite the drug convention saying that they can't. And in this case, I think it seems clear that even if there's no one immediately following in the footsteps of Uruguay now in terms of other governments, although change isn't linear, we could see that coming, at least there's no huge rejection of it either. And I think within the region, at least, and the United States is in a particular, in an awkward position because of allowing Washington and Colorado legalization to go forward, supporting Uruguay to do what it is set out to do as well as it can do will be a very important fact on the ground to bring to this debate. No, there are alternatives, and yes, they can work even better than what came before. So I think those are really important, so that the debate is no longer merely a theoretical debate at that level, but there are real points of progress that the region and those who seek reform can point to. So that was longer than I meant it to be, and I do want to take more questions. So please raise your hand. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. I'm a doctoral student at Temple University here in the States, and I just have a couple questions, mostly about, well, so far we've talked about human rights for consumers in the United States and in the Americas in general. And for consumers, we have a vision, as you were saying, from one of criminalization to a health problem, but I'm curious about how you could intersect human rights and drug policy in regard to producers. So even if you do decriminalize consumption, where does that leave, and I guess the logic is that you decriminalize production, but where does that leave the people that are actually producing illicit crops now? Thank you.
That's a tough and very good question. I think that as you have in place these international conventions that, in that case, they force to criminalize production and distribution, then it's difficult for the states just to say, I will not criminalize and not go against the conventions. But my argument is that if you have strong human rights arguments to decriminalize some parts of all the part of the production and distribution for human rights considerations, then I think you would be justified in the global international legal system. Even if the International Narcotic Board said no, but in the global international legal system, you would say, I have some kind of justification. And I think that has a specific implication in some cases. For instance, you have to criminalize illicit crops. But if you say, if I criminalize illicit crops and I criminalize poor peasants, then I will have many problems to satisfy social rights of these communities, because I would criminalize them instead of providing them alternative means of income that could take them out of the illicit crops. Then you have a very good policy argument, but a very good human rights argument to say, even if I have the conventions, I will not criminalize this kind of producers. I will try to reduce the supply by other means. And I think that is permissible, and that is a kind of human rights consideration to say, I'm not obliged to criminalize all the production and distribution in all the phases, if I can have other kind of policy measures based upon human rights considerations. And that have strong implications. You can use that with small dealers, and to say, okay, I'm not legalizing distribution, but I will use some kind of non-criminal measures for small dealers in order to avoid the overcrowding of our prisons, because our prisons are a place of human rights violation, and if I continue to criminalize, to use harsher criminal measures for small dealers, that would have a very bad impact on human rights. Then that's the idea. Of course, I think that at the end of the day, we have to have the general debate about prohibition. But this is a debate that will take a long time. So we have to have immediate responses to some of the most critical aspects of drug policy.
Yeah. Your question is obviously a valid and important one, and probably the most difficult one. And we don't have a formula. We don't. I don't have a solution for the that I can share with you about how you deal with the whole issue of distribution, production, access, and so forth. But there are some basic points that I think is important for us to reach some fundamental consensus. One is that the current approach is not working, and is the wrong one. It's the wrong one in terms of I mean the current policy, the status quo, has to change. And that is because, you know, the impact on human rights, the fact that we need to agree that this is a public health issue, and finally that you know, if you look at all the studies done in terms of consumption reduction and supply and the price of this substance, the prohibition approach is not working. So, as Rodrigo said before, one thing is to debate this issue in terms of principle human rights values or human rights legal obligations. Another thing is to look at what has been the practical, the empirical impact, and whether we have made any progress, if the whole idea is to reduce consumption and to kill the price of this, you know, to kill the profit for mafias and organized crime. So it's obviously not working. So my sense is that anything could be better than the statu quo, probably at this level, at this point, but it's a very risky proposition. I'm not trying to minimize the risk of changing the current policy to untested policies. So we need to agree that here we are experimenting with different options. Uruguay is the first one who is trying to regulate this by using basically common sense. Another fundamental point is that you need to regulate this one by protecting minors, children. And we should have an agreement that children should be protected from illegal or from the use of or abuse of drugs. You know, when we refer to the right to consumption as a right, we are obviously alluding to the right of adults who could exercise their abilities, their capacities with full autonomy, that they're not acting under coercion, and that, as we said before, it's not going to affect or damage third parties, particularly minors. So I think part of the debate is to, number one, to bring in the empirical data about what has been achieved after so many decades of insisting on the same approach, you know, which is essentially a prohibitionist approach, and then discuss alternatives, but with some, you know, basic values involved, where the state will have to play a central role, the same way that the state has a central role in the access to drugs in the pharmacy, where you need a prescription, you need, you know, to pass a lot of, you know, controls. That is probably the only chance that we have at this point, because you know, we are again experimenting with something new.
Mind if I follow up, or
We do have another, but if you, a quick follow-up is fine.
just a comment then, that I'm just curious if in this case human rights is a matter of lowering incarceration rates, because what I understand is that most of the incarceration is of people who are doing small trafficking in urban areas, whereas most of the human rights violations of producers are, I mean, they're proportionately, I don't think that many arrests happening so much as more militaristic activities, and I'm speaking about Colombia in this case in particular. And so what I'm curious about here is whether for people who upon decriminalization of production, upon like a post-prohibitionist era, if that would ever happen, but just saying, what do you do for people whose best option was illicit crop production, and now likely their best option is going to be joining armed groups and other very dangerous situations? What does that mean for human rights? So, I mean, you can take another question. That was just a follow-up comment that I had. Thank you.
If there is another question, I saw another hand up here. We can add that, and then we would make this the final answer. And then if their speakers want to make any concluding remarks as well. So I thought I saw another hand. But
Here.
I completely agree with all your propositions, especially because when you talk about criminalizing, probably the weakest link in this long chain of drug production and consumption, the jails in Bolivia are full of women and children of women that were only transporting some pounds of cocaine. But trying to be the devil's advocate, because we are talking about Uruguay and that is marijuana, but that is completely different from cocaine and crack. And so when we propose the defense of human rights, and I totally agree with you, but are we ready to deal with all the issues that are going to come if we allow this consumption? I understand this is the right, but for instance, Brazil today is facing a terrible challenge with so many, this called zombie cities, of so many young people consuming. I wonder if this is going to increase if hypothetically we go to the time in which drugs are not prohibited. So are we ready to deal with this tremendous health issue that is going to come about if drugs are, the consumption of drugs are permitted? And at the same time, I totally agree with you. But,
I don't think that the data available shows that by decriminalizing consumption, you will increase consumption. And so far, what I've seen in the case of, for instance, Portugal, is that there was indeed an important increase in consumption after decriminalization. But then the numbers tend to, lower and keep it pretty much stable. But to answer your question, from a strictly legal perspective, I don't think you could distinguish any, using a legal principle to distinguish between marijuana consumption and crack cocaine. And obviously we are not advocating here for, as I said before, for the government to, promote or be, or glorify, as some people said, the use of drugs, free drugs for everyone. It's exactly the opposite, It's, to educate the population and to attend those ones who have developed or could develop addiction to this one, because it's a public health problem, but not to use the prison system.
Yeah, because the problem is in our Latin American countries, and they're ready. Even the United States is not completely ready to give good facilities for drug users. Is Latin America ready for that? I heard from, for instance, in Lima, Peru, many of these so-called facilities that help drug users give them more drugs. Illicit, in an illicit way, sorry. So is Latin America ready to provide this or to face this health challenge?
These are difficult questions. I agree with Jose Miguel that if you take seriously the right to privacy, it's difficult to make strong difference with drugs in the strong legal regime. Of course, you can make strong difference in the policy according to the empirical data of the different drugs. I think that the ones that have the academicians as myself that have been against prohibition for many, many years, we have always been very clear that we are not defending a free market and that there should be differentiated legal structures according to different legal, according to different drugs. As the difference with tobacco and alcohol, you don't have exactly the same legal regime. You have the same principle, but you don't have the same legal regime because there are different drugs with different impacts on health and different impacts on how you can affect the right of third parties. So what we lack is a lot of clear information about how many consumers of cocaine are not abusers, because I think that the issue in a democratic society is not to reduce consumption, but to reduce problematic consumption for the health of the person or for third parties. And usually it's not always, I can make this example. If you have a society in which each adult persons drink 2 wines each day, one at lunch and one at dinner, red wine. If you take the consumption, the prevalence, the indicators of prevalence of consumption, you say it's a terrible society. 100% of persons have declared that in the last week they have drink wine. And if you have the per capita consumption, it would be very, very, very high. You say it's a terrible society with alcohol, and it's not. On the contrary, if you take another society in which only 10% of adults consume alcohol, but what they consume is each 2 weeks they go to a pub, they get drunk, they drink a lot, they take the car and they go and drive with the influence of alcohol, then you will have a society in which you have a less prevalence of alcohol consumption. Even you can have less consumption per capita, but you have, of course, a worse problem of alcohol. So the problem is the kind of consumptions. And why now the issue of legalization of marijuana is so clear? Because a lot of people have shown that most of marijuana consumers are not problematic consumers. There are, of course, some consumers that have problems, but most are not problematic consumers. They can live their life without any kind of problem. Is that the same with cocaine, with heroin? We know some data, but we don't know strong data, so it's difficult to establish exactly how to regulate. We know that we shouldn't regulate it exactly as we regulate marijuana. But if you have a legalized distribution, you can adjust. You can adjust the mechanism. You said, okay, we have this mechanism has increased the abuse, then we are going to change it. And it becomes a more pragmatic, policy-oriented with health objectives. So I think we can manage it, but of course it's difficult to visualize how it could be because we don't have strong data.
Let me add a point to give you a chance to think about what you might say as final remarks. I think we talked in answer to this question. Kind of drugs, yeah, different drugs, different consumption settings, different conditions under which consumption takes place. A lot of the consumption that takes place now in the region in the United States is all the more problematic because it occurs under conditions of criminalization and lack of resources, etc. So that's the reality. The question is whether under an innovative, different system, some of those factors would be improved in a way that the overall problem in terms of the human rights questions are better off as well. So that remains to be seen, but it's the comparison, as a lot of these questions make clear, the comparison about what an innovative approach might bring is not against today's utopia, it's against today's disaster. I think that's why this debate is coming out. And I think there's, the issue of tobacco has come up several times, and Uruguay as well. Uruguay is actually being taken to arbitration by Philip Morris because they have instituted several years ago very strict tobacco control regulations. Okay, so the point again is there are not just different consumption patterns, there's also different legalizations. Right? Tobacco has got accustomed to having its way with legal systems. Right? It was legal, no one was about to re-prohibit it, but that was not in the interest of public health either. So Uruguay is, on the one hand, we want to control and regulate through government authority the cannabis market in our country, but we also want to control and regulate more effectively the legal tobacco industry, and not just multinationals, their own national tobacco companies. So I think that once we get our heads around that, the debates are not completely dissimilar, they're actually complementary. So I think that's before handing it off to Rodrigo and Jose Miguel, I think that really helps tie in, and especially when you push it up to the UN level and these treaties, they're operating in silos that don't acknowledge that in the real world there are actually these issues bleed into one another. So I don't know if either of you has final comments. I don't know if we addressed everyone's questions, but
my final comments are John Walsh's final comments. I agree totally.
My final comment is also I endorse John's view, and I will take in following up a little bit on Professor Ubimi's comments about those societies who drink a glass of red wine at lunch and a glass of red wine at dinner. I think it's, if you try with Chilean wine, and it's also very healthy. Just a glass. That's it.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all who came out on a cold day, those who may be watching via live stream, our speakers especially for being with us. And I wanted to thank Adam Schaefer, who's behind the camera, you wave your hand, and for really helping make this event possible in the first place. So thank you all for coming.